Welcome, Charlotte. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books.
Thanks for having me, Zibby, so much.
I'm so excited to discuss The Weekend with you. This book was so lovely and moving and really well written. And oh my gosh, I was just really looking forward to this conversation. I still think about your character sitting on the side of the road. Like whenever I'm getting in my car now, trapped under an underpass, too narrow to even get out. And I'm like, ah.
Oh, I'm glad they've stayed with you.
Yes. Can you please tell listeners what The Weekend is about?
Sure. The Weekend is about friendship and getting older. And the book opens when three friends, some people have described them as frenemies, but I think they love each other more than that. They're aged in their 70s. Their names are Jude, Wendy, and Adele. And they come together on a very hot weekend in Australia just before Christmas, which I know is kind of weird for American readers to think about Christmas being in the middle of a boiling summer, but in Australia, that's what it's like often. But they come together at the beach house of their fourth friend, Sylvie, who has died just around, I think, a year before the book opens. And they are there to clean out Sylvie's house. And they've been friends for a really long time, for around 40 years. And their friendship is kind of worn by this stage and worn by grief as well. And they've discovered that, well, they're discovering over this weekend particularly, that Sylvie was the one who really held this group together. And without her, they've kind of lost a sense of how to be with each other. They feel that they just feel kind of lost to one another. And it's a very difficult time for them while they grapple with their grief for Sylvie and their grief for their friendship that seems to be kind of dissolving in front of them.
And what inspired you to write this book? Why these characters? Why this weekend? How did you come up with the structure of it and the whole thing? Why not the month or the long weekend
Yeah. It's well, the reason I wanted to write about these women is that I've always been interested in female friendships and how sustaining they are for so many of us. And I've always had quite intense friendships from when I was very young. And I have, quite a lot of women friends who are, I have a really nice husband and my own siblings, but friendships are the thing that kind of propel my days, I guess. And my last book, The Natural Way of Things, was about really young women. And it was a very dark and kind of fairly brutal sort of book about misogyny. And I wanted to kind of release myself and my readers from the darkness of that book and sometimes I just sort of, the way to get away from a previous book is almost just to flip it and go to something opposite. So that was young women, this is older women. That book was set kind of in the middle of the desert in Australia. This book is at the beach on the coast. And it's a much lighter book, even though the story is about these women sort of having to face the fact that they are in the last, years of their lives, even if that's another 10 or 20 years. It's obviously the last phase of their life that they're heading into. And they haven't really thought about that properly. And that's one of the things that each of them is sort of grappling with. But one of the things I was interested in is how do long friendships sustain themselves or not? I think, I have friends of sort of 25 years standing and I love them, but we have changed a lot over that 25 years. And sometimes I feel that old friendships we can just sort of park them a bit. We can sort of set them in cement in some way. And I feel like we need to be able to have our old friendships move and change and live and be as rich as sometimes, when you meet a new person and you kind of fall in love as a friend, with this person because they're kind of facing up with the contemporary you, where sometimes our old friends, and we all do it to each other, can think, well, no, I know who you are. You're the person that I met 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And so I was really interested in sort of casting forward for myself about what kind of woman might I be if I'm lucky enough to reach my 70s, and 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 how will that woman live within the friendships of old, and what might be the forces at work upon all of us at that point.
Wow. You had a great quote in the book. You wrote, "The 30s were the age you fell most dangerously in love," Adele had discovered after the fact, "not with a man or a woman, but with your friends." And you write, "Lovers back then came and went like the weather." But you said, no, it wasn't lovers, but friends, these courageous, shining people you pursued, romanced with dinners and gifts and weekends away. It was so long ago, 40 years. It's so true because usually your life is somewhat set. Friends, I mean, obviously you can get divorced and remarried and whatever, but that's like one or two major changes in your life. But the friends are things they come in and out. I feel like so often at just the right times for what you need.
Yeah, and for these women, they all met, as Adele says, in their 30s. All of them were quite powerful in their professional lives. And a lot of this book is about work, actually, and how women don't just identify with their family identity, they identify with their work. And I feel like in the way that we think about older age in popular culture, in television and in books, often older women are just identified by their family roles, by their roles as mothers or grandmothers or whatever, but or spouses. But often, the women who I know in their 70s are working or wish they were working. They've had very fulfilling professional lives. And these women in my book, Jude was a restaurateur. She ran the city's finest restaurants. She was one of those sort of very powerful women in the hospitality world. And everyone wanted a table at her restaurant, in the city in this book. Adele was a very well-known stage actress, and Wendy was a public intellectual and sort of globally known as a feminist academic and intellectual, and her books are still on university lists around the world. So and in their 30s was, sort of the really blossoming time of their sort of cultural power. And that had this kind of blazing allure for all of them. And they came together through various means. And they were this kind of shining little crowd in their world. And now they're looking at each other going, oh man, I remember when you were so powerful. And now I feel that you might be hiding something, your health isn't great, or you are in a bit of denial about what's going on for you professionally. But they all kind of think of that about each other while not really facing their own, doubts and little crises of confidence that they feel like they can't afford to look at some things that are creeping in at the edges of their vision, but this weekend together kind of forces them to look at those things. And actually, just going back to your earlier question about why a weekend, it's really helpful, I've found, in fiction to kind of bring in the boundaries of time and space to kind of create pressure on people. And for a book like this, it's about the kind of internal lives of women, where not a lot of dramatic things happen. I mean, it does build to a big crisis for them, but there are not world events crashing in on these women. So bringing those sort of edges of the setting in time and space in more tightly allows a sort of concentrated focus, and that it's kind of a crucible effect, I hope, that the pressure just sort of builds. And part of that is the fact that they are just there kind of trapped together in this house for 3 days.
And tell me about the writing of it. So you started out and you found the structure that would work for you and what would create the most pressure to exhibit all these wonderful things and goals that you had for the book. How was the writing process for you, and how did it differ from your first book? Where do you write right there, or how do you do it?
I write here in my studio in Sydney. I also write at a house at the coast where this town that the town and the book is kind of modeled on. It's a couple of hours north of Sydney, and it's a kind of middle class people's holiday town. And that's where Sylvie's beach house is. I wrote it over a few years. So my previous book was the first one I had published in the States, but this is actually my sixth novel. A lot of books published in Australia before that. And I kind of start usually with a place. And this time as I said, I knew I wanted to be near the ocean for the kind of, I felt like I wanted light and air and weather kind of at my disposal, I guess, fictionally. And I knew it was going to be about friendship. So then I just sort of put them in this house together. For ages, Sylvie didn't exist. I just had these three friends and I had them in this house. And I don't really plan my books at all, apart from this kind of setting, I guess. And were having these kind of fractious moments. And I needed to figure out, why are they there? You know, they could easily, if they are having such struggles with their friendship, why don't they just not go? And so then I finally hit on the idea of Sylvie. And actually, because fairly early on in the process of writing the book, a really lovely friend of mine died, became sick and died. And she was a writer, and her name was Georgia Blaine, and she was very, very loved in this country as a writer. And I was really kind of astonished by my grief for Georgia, the kind of ferocity of my grief. And she was my first friend who had died, and I was kind of like, I've been through grief before in my family, but this was really different. And I was kind of slightly, well, I felt really overwhelmed by the kind of primitive feelings of my grief, and the way that I felt like a child and felt so angry and so kind of jealous. And it was such a weird series of feelings that I needed to kind of work them out. And so then, and I knew that Georgia would kind of approve of this way of doing it, because she wrote very close to life herself. And that I could pour all my feelings about this sort of unmanageable grief into these women and their feelings for their friend Sylvie. And I guess when I said jealousy, it's that thing of sort of feeling that, I think early on in the book, Jude confesses sort of in her own head that she was just impatient at hearing about anybody else's death. It was sort of irrelevant. Sylvie was the one who had died, and she just couldn't tolerate anybody else, kind of whining about people dying. And she says, well, people die all the time. Of course they do. But Sylvie, this is different. And I think we all, on some level can feel that sense of ownership and protectiveness of this person, that they had a rich and beautiful individuality that shouldn't be just lumped in with anybody else's. And I actually think this is one of the saddest things about the pandemic, that, and you've been through it more than anybody, that there is this sort of lumping all these people in together, and they are not like other people. So I channeled all that stuff into the story as well. And then, I just sort of observed as much as I could people around me, people I see in the street, thinking about my own friendships and how they may or may not change over the next, 20 years. And about how I used to think that as we grow older, we necessarily begin to know ourselves better and better. And I'm not sure that's true. I don't think that anymore. And I feel like we can carry on kind of illusions about ourselves forever. But sometimes it's our friends who present us with a really kind of shocking assessment of who we are. And I was interested in exploring that as well.
I'm so sorry about your friend. That's terrible. And
Thank you.
did it help? Did the pouring into the characters of all the emotion, did that actually work?
I think it did. I think it did in a way that, it didn't go away. I still
Right.
miss her, but I felt like I kind of honored her in some way, if that's in a way that she would understand, because she was a writer, a fiction writer, and also she was a very funny person. She was she had a very dark sense of humor, and I think that I like to think she would have liked this book, but it helped to express some of those things that you feel kind of ashamed of. I don't know if other people do, but in my grief for her, I felt like I should be more grown up about this. I should be more, I've been through the deaths of both my parents. I've been through other deaths, and I should know how to do this by now. But I was just kind of hammered by these very primitive kind of savage feelings, and I think sometimes that's what literature is for, is to allow space for these kind of things that are unspeakable, that we feel like we're feelings we're not allowed to have. Um, that literature is a place where we are allowed to have them.
It's funny to think about like the bookshelves behind you and everything, that in each one is all the feelings that people couldn't say. And so we open it up and we're like,
Mm.
oh my gosh. It's like poured out, like it's almost like containers, like a wall of Tupperware almost
Mm.
for everybody's feelings. It's
I
like
think that's
the
true.
container store. Yeah.
And it's private, it's a private place for us to go to. I think, unlike television or film or other sort of media, a book is such a private space for the reader and the story. And I feel like that's why reading is so precious to me, because it's only me and the book. And I mean, I know you can watch television by yourself, but somehow it doesn't have the same effect because it's in your own head, I guess. You're not, all the pictures are pictures that you make, and the people are people that you make as a reader. So I feel that it's almost, I feel, this sounds weird, but it's kind of almost a holy thing to me, that space of a book for a reader.
It's true. It's like the only form of mental telepathy that we have, right? It's spilling out
Yeah.
the insides of your mind that goes right into the insides of someone else's mind. Like, how else would you do that? TV, you're like, I don't know, I'm on my phone, I'm like, whatever, this is like, and it also requires your complete attention, or else you can't actually read. So,
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The absorption that comes with reading. Yeah, you can't cook and read at the same time.
I
Whereas
guess the audiobooks, I guess
other me,
audiobooks,
yeah, that's true actually.
but
It's another whole
pretty
discussion.
skilled. um, are you working on another novel now?
I am. I've just sort of started. It's taken me a while to settle in. The pandemic just, I mean, we've been really lucky in Australia, very, very lucky in terms of the scale. But it certainly, everyone was terrified, and we had a big lockdown that, has gone on for some parts of the country for a long time. But so the mental focus was not there for a long time, but I'm getting back into it now. And the new one is going to be about, in some way, it's so embryonic that I don't really know anything about it yet, but it's going to involve nuns, Catholic nuns. I grew up Catholic, and I've never really written about that part of my, the influences on me. And I just thought, there's some interesting stuff there. That sort of tension between being in the world and being out of the world is really interesting to me. The kind of big capitalist world that the rest of us live in. But it's very early days, so who knows?
Do you have any advice for aspiring authors?
I think my advice would be don't wait to start doing it. Just start, because life is short. We know that now more than ever. And so just dive in wherever you are, even if you don't have time, even if you are working full time in a job. My first several books were written when I had full time work. I used to write on the couch at night or on the weekends. You don't need a space to work in. All you need really at the most basic is a pencil and a piece of paper. So there's nothing stopping you but your own mind, really. And it can be a home to go to. It can be the most thrilling, wonderful, liberating thing to have in your life. So I would just say don't wait. And the other thing I would say is just try and tell the truth. And that sounds weird when you're talking about fiction, but write stuff that feels true to you, not to please anybody else, not to impress anybody else, not for the market. Just because readers will respond when you are deeply connected and immersed in the work. And I think a lot of new writers spend far too much time worrying about whether this kind of work will sell, or you shouldn't write in first person because blah. There's so many bits of really silly advice out there. So I hope this isn't another one of those. But just start and be sincere and put everything into it.
Well, thank you, Charlotte. Thank you for sharing your grief in this way that now comes and helps the rest of us. And thanks for your lovely, wonderful book, and for introducing us to these characters.
Thank you so much, Zibby, for having me. And I'd send lots of love to everyone in the States right now.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And to Australia. We'll just send love to our entire nations. Why not?
Why not?
Ambassadors for the evening.
Yeah.
All
Thank
right.
you,
Well,
Zibby.
thank you so much. All right. Bye-bye.